Hi, everyone. Pariegak. Thank you all for joining us this evening or this morning for Irina, this afternoon for our friends on the West Coast. Thank you. This is the third in our series of What's Next discussions. Debunking myths on the road to a sustainable Armenia, a discussion about leadership, cynicism, and priorities with author and political analyst Irina Khaplanyan. Dr. Khaplanyan, thank you for your work and thank you for making yourself available at an absolutely inconvenient time. For those who are not aware of the time differences, it's 2 o'clock in the morning in Yerevan. The idea for this talk came out after reading Dr. Khaplanyan's book, Post-Soviet Armenia, The New National Elite and the New National Narrative, which oddly enough, my son picked up in the bookshop while visiting Istanbul with friends last summer. The idea for the talk came from the obvious observation that myths and false beliefs are used to generally manipulate and misdirect while perpetuating shortcomings and deficiencies, distractions, and thereby creating artificial obstacles to solvable problems. This, of course, is not a problem that is unique to Armenia, and the United States is also home to many foundational and ongoing myths and false beliefs pertaining to many matters, including gun control, which continues to break our hearts on a near daily basis and destroying families, and other matters such as racism and white supremacy, violence on January 6, COVID-19 and vaccines, and the list goes on. It is a matter that requires more attention and more than just an intuitive understanding. And for this reason, beginning Tuesday, July 5th, St. Leon will sponsor a 4-week class on Zoom with Khachik Muradyan titled Gray Wolves and Pink Elephants, The Science of Denial and False Beliefs. The course will examine denial and false beliefs, relying on scientific research in various fields of study. Each session will survey research on aspects of false beliefs and their propagation, and then delve into case studies, primarily from the United States, Turkey, and Armenia. There will be 4 90-minute classes. Tuition for 4 sessions will be a $75 donation per household to the St. Leon Armenian Church. And the registration link is bit.ly, which is bit.ly/pink elephants. That's pink dash elephants, and the P and the E are uppercase. The other letters are lowercase. Khachik's a wonderful instructor. He's a lecturer at Columbia University and the Armenian and Georgian area specialist at the Library of Congress. We've organized more than half a dozen classes together, and it promises to be a rewarding experience for the entire family. I'd also like to take this opportunity to inform and encourage our audience members in the United States and Ontario to take the Armenia Diaspora survey. It's a public opinion study project. The current leg of the project launched in May and will continue through July 29th. If you consider yourself to be a member of the Armenian diaspora, you're encouraged to share your thoughts and views about identity, culture, and community, and help us gain a better understanding of the Armenian diaspora. The survey is a tremendous resource for scholars, activists, and Armenian organizations. And if you go to the armeniadiasporasurvey.com website, you can also see information that's already been aggregated from past legs of the survey. The survey is funded by the Armenian Communities Department of the Kalus Gulbenkian Foundation, and is carried out under the auspices of the Armenian Institute in London at the direction of Dr. Hırat Çilingirian. The head of the local coordinating group is Aida Erba. Your views and ideas are important. Please make your voice heard by completing the questionnaire. At this time, I'd like to convey special thanks to our sponsors for today's talk. They are AGBU Ararat, Iowa, New Jersey chapter, the Ararat Eskidjan Museum, the Armenian Democratic Liberal Party, Ramgavars, Justice Armenia, Knights of Vartan Bakraduni Lodge, and the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, NASR, Kalus Gulbenkian Foundation Lecture Series on Contemporary Armenian Issues, and St. Leon Armenian Church. Now, let's learn a little more about Dr. Khaplanyan. She's a political scientist, climate negotiator, and published author. Irina holds a doctorate in political science from the University of Cambridge. Her main areas of expertise are political leadership, states in transition, climate politics, environmental management, gender and conflict, as well as security studies. Her education includes a master's degree in diplomatic studies from the Diplomatic Academy of London and a Bachelor of Arts degree in international relations from the University of Malta. Dr. Khaplanyan served as Deputy Minister of Environment for the Republic of Armenia between 2018 and 2020. Currently, she acts as a senior advisor on climate change to the World Bank Group and also teaches at the American University of Armenia. Dr. Khaplanyan has worked in a number of international organizations and think tanks around the world, including UNDP, Georgetown University, Eurasia Foundation, and Chatham House. Thank you, Irina, for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Irina, we're going to begin with a few questions, and then we're going to open it up for the audience if there are also questions. For our audience members, I ask that you use the Q&A function to ask your questions. And why don't we begin? There are some key conceptual categories around which myths have proliferated. And some of these issues, concepts, these areas are survival, security, and exceptionalism, all of which are touched upon in Dr. Khaplanyan's book. So really, this is a talk will be beyond what's covered in the book, but really in order to really benefit from Dr. Khaplanyan's experience, her work, I encourage you to go to the NASER website and pick up a copy of the book, and that's naser.org. So Dr. Khaplanyan, can you share some of the myths surrounding these issues, survival, security, exceptionalism, and how they have been useful to domestic elites and their supporters? If you could, please include an example from the current administration as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. It's such a deep question for 2 a.m. in the morning here, but perhaps the right time to discuss. I think when we talk about these myths, we have to go back to the early years of Armenia's state building, and particularly when we talk about the myth of survival. And as I document in my book extensively, unfortunately, in the continuously, we see with all of the now 4 administrations that held power in the country, the myth of survival continues to be exploited. And in reality, we collectively didn't graduate from the narrative of survival, unfortunately, when we inherited a state, an independent state, which we so fiercely fought for so many centuries. And I think that is one of the issues that I extensively cover in my book, that the issue of survival continued to be a narrative that had politically, had been exploited politically by various administrations, inclusive of those of Ter-Petrosyan, Kocharyan's, and Serge Sargsyan's administrations, and continues to be exploited. On the issue of security, I think we need to be very frank with ourselves and talk about the share of the responsibility for the non-resilience of our security infrastructure lying with each of the administrations. If we talk about the previous administrations, they're directly responsible for essentially looting the armed forces, deliberate over-reliance on Russia as a sole strategic partner. In its turn, current administration has not relied so much on technocrats, on the right skill set and skills of officials who were staffed in the armed forces and defense infrastructures and institutions, and got into the same trap of perpetuating false sense of security when the facts and data actually spoke of different reality, when the facts and data spoke of the imminent threat of war, starting from actually many experts talked about how security was undermined already in 2016 and a large-scale war was imminent. So, and of course, exceptionalism this myth follows all small nations. It's something that is by default inherited with nations that are reduced in number but have had grand history, like Armenians, and we continue to rely on the past grand historical events and grandeur of our cultural and historical heritage. And that unfortunately is exploited by politicians, and has been exploited by different political administrations, including for security purposes, for military purposes. And I'll give you an example. If in the first war in Artsakh in the 1990s, we did have the ratio of 1-3 with our enemy in terms of our capacity and the scale of the amount and volume of weaponry, etc. We did conclude the war with a much better outcome than what had happened in 2020. But this exceptionalism perpetuated well into the 2020 war, and the bravado that our administration carried with itself, knowingly that we're going into a full-scale war, resulted in what we saw in fall of 2020, essentially. So I think particularly when we talk about the narrative of exceptionalism, we have to be very careful of how different political administrations and political ideologies, both within Armenia and within Armenian diaspora, have instrumentalized that to the unfortunately detriment of states' resilience and state sustainability, and of course, resilience of state institutions that unfortunately we see still significantly lacking.
Thank you, Irina. And these myths, and it's not all necessarily just myths, because survivalism has been a valid, legitimate narrative based on our experience. But it's, I guess, the exploitation of these narratives and myths, sub-myths created around that, which is more problematic. Let me also ask, in terms of these myths, do you see them also being exploited by non-domestic players? If so, how? And could you give us an example? Probably pre-2020 and after 2020, I think would be interesting to hear.
Yes, I think, in fact, let me come back again to the war of 2020 and the myth of the Armenian exceptionalism of Armenian armed forces was completely destroyed in the war of 2020, because exactly for that very reason, because it was a myth. And it was perpetuated not only by Armenian consecutive administrations, but also by countries like Russia, because we modeled our security forces, we modeled even our armed forces reforms on what Russia has projected, and has Russia being our main strategic military partner. So absolutely, these myths have been exploited not only by domestic players, but also by foreign players.
Thank you. Thank you. In chapter 7 of your book, you write that the Armenian political leadership subjected the country to a crippling dependency on Moscow. Would you kindly describe what you mean by crippling, and how relations with Moscow were and are presented to the public prior to and after the war?
Yes.
Do you want me to repeat that, or are we good?
Sure, no.
Okay.
As you rightly noted, absolutely. I in detail document the periods, particularly the period of Kocharyan's administration, when all of the vital infrastructure in the country was essentially given away or exchanged in return for debt forgiveness, or given preferential treatment to Russian state-controlled companies or Russia-based companies. And that has to do with infrastructures such as railroad infrastructures, such as telecommunications, energy, and of course, nuclear power plant. And we see that, every year, particularly, and the largest chunk, of course, of that vital infrastructure giveaway as such occurred under Kocharyan's administration. And by default, leading Armenia to such crippling economic dependency would limit Armenia's options in generally foreign policy, let alone security and military policy. And that was, I believe, the period in Armenia's recent history that, from the political perspective as well, we registered a lot of losses. And unfortunately, we don't talk much about it because when we're referring to, again, another myth that Armenia has no choice, that we're cornered, et cetera, we fail to talk about the significance of economic infrastructures, vital infrastructures within the country that have been given away to Russia in a period, during a period where Armenia actually had economic growth.
Thank you. In your book, you describe how geopolitical considerations or geopolitical explanations are given for such developments with perhaps the asset debt forgiveness exchange, where the primary drivers were actually domestic considerations. The primary consideration there being regime preservation, let's say. Can you describe some of these examples where different explanations were given when the primary driver was actually a domestic consideration?
Absolutely, and I think that occurred in essentially all four of the political administrations since Armenia's independence. And geopolitical considerations, when we can't talk about domestic politics without keeping them in conjunction with foreign politics, particularly in our region, where right now we see essentially a civilizational struggle of, again, another myth. And I want to connect what I wrote in my book to another current battle of myths and narratives, especially following the end of Nagorno-Karabakh war. A narrative emerged that Armenia's transitioning to democracy and Armenia's government commitment to democracy cost its loss in the war, or the narrative of democracy versus security. And we see that absolutely false narrative and false myth are unfortunately articulated by not only politicians, but some so-called academics, which is very dangerous because, first of all, there's no evidence to back up these claims. But secondly, I think when we talk about security versus democracy, we fail to give a true assessment to what had transpired in Armenia over the past 30 years. So today, this unfortunately also becomes an issue of domestic struggle in Armenia, where we see the opposition constantly articulating a narrative that also has elements that, unfortunately, Armenia's democracy came at a very high cost of the country losing the war in Nagorno-Karabakh. And this, again, as I said, is a civilizational battle of two aspiring, I used to call it aspiring, but now I'm more ambitious in calling indeed democracies, that is Armenia and Artsakh, being sandwiched among dictatorships. And this type of geopolitical scenario is quite challenging, to put it mildly, right? So when we talk about geopolitical considerations driving domestic politics, the other way around as well. So right now, particularly, we see this battle. And that's why we see such increased engagement of different Western powers trying to reinforce the narrative of the opposite. And we see engagement of dictators to reinforce the exact content of this myth. And one thing that is clearly very encouraging is that since the Velvet Revolution of 2018, we see increased maturity of Armenian citizenry and understanding of democratic values. And this we see quite clearly come through various polls that have been conducted in the country over the past 2 years, particularly since the end of the war. And we see that, for example, the recent poll by CRRC showed that there's strong trust towards, for example, the European Union. Yet, you would question, but European Union didn't partake in supporting Armenia during the war, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, the European Union has been investing in so much through soft power in the country, and also supporting Armenia's democratic transition and building of democratic institutions. And it is very, very encouraging to see that our citizenry is gradually conceiving of this important role and conceiving of the absolutely foundational and key principles of freedom and that democracy brings. And this is certainly very encouraging. But again, this is very challenging considering that we are surrounded by dictatorships, we are surrounded by essentially a civilizational battle of these myths. And yet our electorate, our citizenry continues to remain very focused on priorities, which is, again, encouraging. One other important observation from the recent poll also that there is continued distrust in the executive branch and in the National Assembly. And unfortunately, the citizenry doesn't express strong trust towards the power institutions in Armenia, but it continues to trust, and the highest actually scores of public trust towards existing domestic institutions, again, are with the armed forces. I think the score was at 72%, and with the Human Rights Defenders Office. So it's an interesting contrast that on the one hand, the people in Armenia are understanding of the value and nature and the functions of the human rights defender, and also understand still the existing existential threat to our security, and continue to support the armed forces and have strong trust towards the armed forces, despite obviously the unfortunate outcome of the war in 2020.
Thank you. Thank you. You mentioned an often presented sentiment that we have no options, a similar sentiment being that Armenia has no friends. What's your reaction when you hear such sentiments presented as self-evident truths? Is this yet the creation of another myth to provide for, let's say, a cover for the failed security partnership with Russia? And how does it affect what you describe in your book as the country's love affair with Russia, if you could?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think I completely agree. Indeed, it's another myth, and it largely comes from again, trapping Armenia's foreign policy in a unilateral setting by previous administrations. But also, I think we need to be very realistic in and very frank in discussing this particular issue related to this being the myth. And I want to talk about the non-engagement, or rather, lack of not only official but public diplomacy, track 2 diplomacy, backdoor diplomacy, all kinds of diplomacies. If you look at the Armenian state institutions, one of the closest and very traditionally conservative institution has been the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Another one, obviously, the Ministry of Defense. And these are the institutions that are extremely slow to reform and open up to new modalities and new ways of engagement and cooperation with the partners. So when we say that Armenia has no friends, no options, we first need to, give a true assessment of how Armenia has engaged with the international community. And that has to do both with bilateral entities as well as multilateral entities. And let's take, for example, CSTO. And CSTO is a Russian military alliance, essentially, with a number of members, but largely controlled, with Russia being the largest member in that organization. Sorry, CSTO, Collective Security Treaty Organization, that's what I'm referring to, right? And with the same organization, when Armenian government criticized extensively the members of the CSTO, the member countries, for the lack of reaction and support towards Armenia, the question would come up, how engaged was Armenia in bilateral relationship with these member states, correct? The same goes for other multilateral institutions, organizations, and other entities and countries. So I think before we start, getting ourselves trapped again in this narrative of survival and narrative of exceptionalism, we need to give a true assessment of how effective Armenia's diplomacy has been for decades, for us to claim anything in terms of lack of engagement of the international community with Armenia and lack of the reaction. Another frank assessment needs to be done on the lack of strategic communication coming out of Armenia during the war itself, following up to the war, during the war, and even after the war. Only recently, in the past few months, we see more engaged Armenia's diplomacy, and maybe that has to do also with the change in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, having political appointments there, as opposed to career diplomats who have been part and parcel of that institution. But again, we need to be very frank in understanding how well Armenia has strategically communicated with its international partners before we start assessing and giving different labels to the way international community has reacted. And building friendships in interpersonal relationship requires work, the same way building a relationship with countries is requiring consistent work, something that unfortunately our adversaries have done extremely well, obviously investing a lot of petrodollars in that. But again, this doesn't necessarily require much volume. What it requires is much funding and support, financial support. What it first and foremost requires is a vision in terms of how Armenia engages with its partners. It requires a strategy and, of course, an action plan with each and every country that is on Armenia's strategic partnership list, and, of course, with each and every entity. And even after all of these dramatic and traumatic events that Armenia has experienced, still, the assessment of Armenia's diplomacy is not very satisfactory. I strongly believe that we can engage more proactively. There are multiple modalities through which Armenia can be engaged more with various entities. And again, to reiterate myself a few times, before we give assessments to Armenia has no options, we don't have friends, and the international community didn't react, let's give a true assessment of how we have engaged for decades with those partners.
Sounds wise. Sounds wise. And obviously certain statements are said and certain questions are framed a certain way where they kind of lead to there being no answer, right? And as you said, us having no friends, and that sentiment needs to really be deconstructed and looked at in terms of what our history has been, in terms of our efforts, and whether or not we have isolated ourselves and how that can be changed. So with regard to, let's say, since the war, you mentioned that more could have been done. I mean, how much is being done? How much improvement has there been, let me say? How much more of a focus and how much attention is diplomacy getting at this juncture under this administration, if I may ask?
Certainly, as I said, there has been some good progress with most recent leadership at the ministry, but again, I think there's a lot room for more engagement, more modalities, and better strategizing. Something that Armenia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs has lacked for decades is, and this comes by default as a result of super presidentialism we had for many years, and unfortunately we continue to see extreme verticality within Armenian government institutions, which hinders and prevents those institutions to develop their own capacity, right? And I'll give you an example of the period under Ter-Petrosyan administration, when the entire Ministry of Foreign Affairs invested time, effort, and immense capacity in negotiating the association agreement with the European Union. And overnight, in November of 2013, the decision was made at the president's office that Armenia is going to join the Eurasian Economic Union. Just to give you a deeper understanding, the entire Ministry of Foreign Affairs was in the dark, including the highest levels of officials of that ministry, that transition would have happened. And this is a clear example of how not to run government institutions. You have an entire structure that is designed to develop policies, develop scenario, develop negotiation points, yet you have a narrow circle within presidential office at the time that was negotiating all of these things. And 4 years lost to potential very important step in Armenia's foreign policy. And then us transitioning to the Eurasian Economic Union was definitely administratively and institutionally a painful process. Equally now, unfortunately, we still see that verticality in governance remains. That largely comes with this particular administration from continued lack of trust in various bureaucrats. Obviously, having inherited an entire system filled and staffed with bureaucrats that served under previous administration leads to that lack of trust. But that leads also to lack of trust in bringing in technocrats that can run government institutions better, that can undertake systemic reform, that understand what systemic reform requires in governance, and strong and effective government institutions. So we still see that, and we see that also coming from not only Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but Ministry of Defense, et cetera, et cetera. Now we see gradually some changes with more political appointments, both at the Ministry of Defense and Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where we see some type of alignment between the Prime Minister office, Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And it is important to note that for years there was resistance to political appointments in these particular institutions, I guess with the exception of the appointment of Vigen Sarkisyan as Minister of Defense under Ter-Petrosyan's administration. But again, also he faced a lot of challenges, and undertaking simple reforms took a lot longer for his team than it should have taken, given the resistance of these institutions to reform. So yeah, I think there is still a lot of work that needs to be done, including the alignment of messaging to the international community from all of these institutions, which is increasingly improving given the new appointments. But of course, more transparency, more honesty, particularly with this administration coming to power with essentially one most powerful, apologies for redundancy of the terms, political capital that Nikol Pashinyan had at the time of the Velvet Revolution is transparency, which I think, especially during and after the war, he dramatically lost much of that transparency and much of the electorate due to lack of transparency during the war and after, including these current negotiations and vague statements, which obviously, for a number of objective reasons, need to remain to a certain extent, closed. But yet again, I come back to the importance of more strategic communication with your electorate. And again, the current domestic crisis with the opposition out on the streets is a testament to lack of strategic communication by this administration, not only with its foreign partners, but also with its domestic audience, which is obviously being exploited by the political opposition.
Actually, there was a question asked, and I'm going to ask a question from the audience rather than waiting to the end, because it segues perfectly. And this is from Alan. And please, if you ask questions and you don't want me to mention your name, please note so in the question. Otherwise, I'll mention your first name. Alan asks, is another problematic myth of Armenia that was betrayed by political rivals. And I'm assuming, Alan, if you can clarify, I assume you mean domestic rivals. But what do you think?
If Alan refers to domestic rivals, absolutely. I think the betrayal has been consistent with various administrations, including the current, continuing to, before the war in 2020, to articulate a narrative that was diametrically in opposition to what had been discussed in the negotiations. The infamous statement of Nikol Pashinyan prior to the war, Artsakh heißt Ane Verch, it's a great symbolic example of what had been articulated also by previous administrations, that there will be no concessions on the part of Armenia because Armenia was a victorious state. At least this current administration recognizes its mistakes, and the leader of the current administration has articulated that that was indeed the mistake of this administration, not being more transparent and open about the content of the negotiations, right? And feeding the public with a completely different narrative. That's certainly something that I would squarely put into the betrayal, not only between political rivals, but also between political forces and the populace. If you're negotiating certain concessions and that's on the table, and that this is going to be part of the deal, prepare your population for that. Be frank. Create more mature approach towards your electorate on the possible outcomes of the negotiations over the conflict. That's why you manage expectations in politics. That's why it is so critically important to have clear and strategically sound communication from political administrations, which we have not seen with previous administration and which we consistently see this administration lacking as well.
Thank you. Now, let's shift a little bit to the diaspora, because you also write about the diaspora. I think the chapter is failed marriage. I think you could have also probably used the blind date as well, probably. But you've written that the diaspora was regarded by those in power as a liability or even a threat, given its human, socio-cultural, and economic resources, and therefore its political potential. So a threat because of its political potential. For this reason, diaspora was allowed to pursue charitable endeavors, but marginalized from political and socioeconomic spheres. As such, narrow agendas and vested interests prevailed over the agenda of national unification. These are your words. So may I ask, in the past and the present, what was the rhetoric compared to the policies or laws that were crafted that shaped the role of the diaspora in Armenia, or diasporans, let's say, even in Armenia? So I'm looking for the divergence of rhetoric and policy, so to speak.
Yes. Well, I think just to add to my quote from the book, I would also say that largely diaspora also was regarded as a threat because of the value system of the most powerful, wealthy, and numerous diaspora that we're talking about and referring to the diaspora, Armenian diaspora coming from the Western countries and mostly Western democracies. In fact, there's a prominent diaspora scholar who talked about Armenian diaspora being more Western and espousing more Western value systems, even in countries that of Middle East, and let alone in countries of European continent and United States, Canada, and elsewhere. So that's another important value, another important aspect that is the value system that a lot of diasporans espouse, which was not aligned with the value system espoused by the previous administration, where we saw a lot of corruption and not commitment to truly democratic reforms within the government and governance system. And unfortunately, rampant corruption from lower to middle and higher level bureaucrats across the government system. So that was another important aspect that essentially led to political administrations marginalizing entry of diasporan Armenians into the governance system and essentially nation building of the process. And that is unfortunately indeed a failed marriage, because you either marry someone or you don't. You embrace all of the negatives and positives of that person or that entity. And of course, there's a lot of academic literature on diaspora itself having a lot of institutional problems, a lot of ideological problems, not being inclusive, and the classical diaspora institution versus the emerging younger diaspora generation not wanting to fit into the different boxes and frameworks that classical so-called diaspora institutions espouse. So indeed, diaspora itself has a lot of institutional, political, social problems with itself. But I think when discussing the role of diaspora, particularly for Armenia, we need to focus on Armenia as a leading agency. And I think there have been consistent failures of our administration, equally so as I document in my book with all of the previous administrations, starting from Ter-Petrosyan all the way to Sarkisyan, from the types of officials that led the key executive body, that is the Ministry of Diaspora, to the type of programs that were launched and projected and operated and funded by the state budget, again, in and of themselves, marginalizing the role of diaspora to only those of cultural, economic, sports, etc., but certainly not political role. And that marginalization further was reinforced with the constitutional reforms in 2015, when even the list of not only the list of those officials in both the executive and the legislature of Armenia could not be diasporan Armenians by default, because you would have to be not only residing in Armenia, I think for various officials, somewhere between 5 and 7 or 8 years. You also could not hold any other citizenship but Armenian citizenship. So by default, marginalize the entire human capital of diaspora when it comes to governance, systemic reform, etc., from appointing them to higher office in the country, and then not leaving other room for political engagement of diaspora and Armenians into Armenia's national building, when in all reality, all of the entities continuously talk about what we have is the human capital, both in Armenia and diaspora, and we need to bring them and invest not only in the economy, but also in nation building, state building, bring all of that human talent in undertaking expedient reforms in order to improve governance. And when we look at the reforms that this administration has done, it further reinforces that Armenia does not have a sound strategy of engagement with the Armenian diaspora, and that is, and I want to give you a specific example. When Nikol Pashinyan came to power, there were, I think, 17 ministries at the time, and the administration decided that they have to undertake governance reform and either join some ministries or dissolve certain ministries. And unfortunately, a number of key institutions within Armenia's executive fell victim to this very short-sighted approach towards undertaking institutional governance reform in a country where there was no functional and operational analysis done on the roles and functions of each of the ministries. But there was a goal set that we need to reduce the administrative burden of all these of the government at large, and reduce all of these ministries in their number. So what we saw is, for example, a country like Armenia, that is the only country that has nuclear power potential in the region, does not have a Ministry of Energy anymore. Ministry of Energy was merged with the Ministry of Territorial Administration and Infrastructures. A country like Armenia, where close to 30% of your workforce is employed in agriculture, does not have a Ministry of Agriculture. It was merged with the Ministry of Economy. Equally so, a country like Armenia, whose population is 3 times less than its population abroad, or its nationals abroad, dissolved its Ministry of Diaspora, and keeping all the functions and the workload, and in fact increasing that, created an office of the Office of High Commissioner for Diaspora, and in the hindsight, perhaps the intentions were good, because that way they were able to appoint a diasporan Armenian to run the institutions. But in the larger scheme of things, it hurt the narrative, the political message, the functions, the budgetary concerns, and limited the potential of the office to operate as effectively as it could possibly, because one thing is to have an office of a high commissioner, another thing is to have an entire ministry, which unfortunately was dissolved. So, there's short-sighted, there are perhaps sometimes good intentions, but short-sightedness with this particular administration also coming from lack of experience, lack of engagement of technocrats and governance experts, and reliance on inner circle of political loyalists, which again has its objective explanations or perhaps justification as to why the current administration resorts to such policies. But again, it comes at the expense of effective governance, which we see, particularly this administration, sorely lacks.
Beth asks, does Armenia have qualified technocrats to enter government positions and create the necessary systemic reforms?
Yes, Armenia has, in fact, a lot of good, Armenia has a great talent pool, both domestically and in the diaspora. And I think one of the reasons that there's lack of engagement is that there's no clear strategy from this government. And we continuously see that the government faces lack of trust within its own institutions towards bureaucrats. There have been open, statements by highest level in the government about lack of trust towards the bureaucrats that are, in rough terms, leftovers from previous administrations. So this perpetuates this problem. But indeed, I certainly can attest that we have some good technocrats who are risk managers, something Armenia currently needs, who understand what systemic reform entails. And another problem, again, is some of these people come from governance experience from previous administrations. And unfortunately, they're labeled as those that are leaning towards the previous administration's political agenda, and they're immediately discounted. So that's another, unfortunately, factor that plays into the cadre politics of this administration.
Thank you. We touched upon this a little bit when we talked about national security, but you have a chapter dedicated, and the title of it is The Nerve of Armenian Politics, where you write about the Artsakh conflict and the threat of conflict and how it was exploited for political, military, and economic control. And could you talk a little bit about that? Yes,
absolutely. It was a
if you could also talk about a little bit how how this was this unfolded in Yerevan as well as in Stepanakert, because I think it's important to see to what extent Stepanakert has also been part of this dynamic. Thanks.
Yeah. I'll be very frank. Writing that chapter was perhaps the most painful because as I was analyzing, and part of my methodology was analyzing the discourse of different political administrations as well as the opposing sides in the media at the time, inclusive of the 90s, during the war, 2000s, and late 2000s, already under Ter-Petrosyan's administration. And, one thing we need to be very frank and clear about Armenia's post-Soviet history is that the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict and the fight for Nagorno-Karabakh's recognition preceded the claims for statehood, preceded the collapse of the Soviet Union and Armenia becoming an independent state. So by default, Nagorno-Karabakh issue became the foundational aspect of Armenian domestic politics. And ignoring that was, I think, to the detriment of this administration, but I will elaborate that on another point. The nerve of Armenian politics comes from this very aspect that it became foundational part of Armenia's political trajectory, both domestically and in its foreign policy. And each of the administrations that came to power, they came in one way or another on the wave of political issues related to Nagorno-Karabakh. First was Ter-Petrosyan, who was a member of the Karabakh Committee. Then was Robert Kocheryan, who again was himself from Artsakh and participated in the war. And of course, his successor, Ter Sarkisyan, as well, intimately connected with the military side of the war, and of course, later the political side of the conflict and conflict resolution. So this is a key aspect in understanding how also political narratives of these administrations were exploited for various reasons. And we need to be very frank again with the assessment of our own diplomatic and political mistakes, both domestically and on foreign policy front, in order to give the right assessment and value and moving forward to understand what to do or not to do. And that has to do particularly, and I want to give you an example from Robert Kocheryan's administration. When he came to power, he infamously stated that himself being from Nagorno-Karabakh, he would represent Nagorno-Karabakh, Artsakh better in negotiations than Karabakh itself. And with the biggest diplomatic failure of Armenia itself, Nagorno-Karabakh was removed from the negotiating format. You know, when I was researching this particular period in Armenia's history, I tried very hard to get as many interviews as possible and to get those officials to answer some hard questions. And it was very hard to crack. It was very hard to get to the bottom of what had transpired and why this was. But bottom line, the statements made, documented in the media by Kocheryan himself, were that he would represent Nagorno-Karabakh better in negotiations than Nagorno-Karabakh itself. And this is when we registered the biggest diplomatic failure, because when we talk about the status of Nagorno-Karabakh and the eventual resolution of the conflict, first and foremost, it's the rights and the security of the people of Artsakh that have to matter. And it's their voices that have to matter, and it's their voices that have to be heard at the international arena, at the negotiating table, and we're the ones to remove those voices. So this is something that we need to continuously remember and know that, unfortunately, this was also exploited for political purposes during Kocheryan's administration. And then moving forward, you know, we see this narrative of either under securitization of the conflict, which was done during Ter-Petrosyan's administration, or over securitization during the administration of Ter Sarkisyan. And again, you know, there was the Ministry of Foreign Affairs attempted to develop various scenarios of the resolution to the conflict, to the extent where there were tabled some within the circles of the ministry suggestions of, you know, giving up one of the territories adjacent to Artsakh proper as a sign of goodwill and show of diplomatic force and political willingness to not continue holding maximalist position, and showing that there is a political will on the part of the Armenian government to give up some of these territories in exchange for nothing, to show that it is ready to negotiate and not keep its maximalist position. This wasn't done, and political administrations continued to articulate the narrative that was, again, diametrically opposed to what they were negotiating in and signing in negotiations within the format of OSCE Minsk Group. So that's something that we need to be constantly mindful of, that this, unfortunately, disingenuity cost us war, because when you build up expectations of your electorate, of your citizenry about something that's non-existent, then you become hostage to this narrative, and you're not willing to start the process of preparing your population for certain concessions, because as a winning party in the war of 90s, we had the political and diplomatic weight to do that. Unfortunately, right now we don't, and in fact, I strongly condemn the current narrative coming out of official Yerevan when it comes to negotiations, because negotiating on the terms of undemocratic peace is counterproductive, and hopefully we can touch upon that as well, but certainly is very concerning for not only Armenia, but also the security of the people of Artsakh.
Thank you, Irina. You just mentioned, though, we can talk about it later, but let's talk about it now for a minute, because you mentioned about negotiating on the basis of an undemocratic peace. By an undemocratic peace, do you mean a peace that does not provide the rights, the collective rights of the Artsakh population, or something else, just so that I have a better understanding?
Absolutely. I think we need to be clear in assessing the current situation, which is official Baku is dictating the terms, and those terms are completely canceling out anything related to the rights of the people of Artsakh. Whether the political rights or security rights and safety. And moreover, we should document very clearly and constantly articulate this in our discussions and assessment of the situation, that since the end of the war, official Baku continues to lay claims not only on Artsakh, completely canceling out the existence of Artsakh Armenians and the discussion about the status of Artsakh, but also laying claims to Armenia proper. And this is concerning. This is concerning also because, unfortunately, this becomes also, or rather, those mediators who wish confident well for the outcome of the existing conflict in the South Caucasus become trapped in this type of narrative because it's extremely misleading. And let's talk about the recent events in Artsakh in March. I was actually there right before, and March was extremely cold, unprecedentedly cold, and we had not only this continuous, projection through loudspeakers threatening border villages and communities that they need to leave and evacuate the villages. This time around, they also started what I call climate terrorism, knowing that March was extremely cold month with sub-zero temperatures. They cut off the gas, and the energy supply was cut off for a month. And this was pure state-level terrorism, essentially trying to push out the population in Artsakh. And the definition for this is creeping ethnic cleansing. So Baku continues to project this narrative. Not only does it project this narrative, but also it continues to act as a partner not to be trusted. That is, these threats to the populations, cutting off gas supply, laying claims, talking about non-existence of Nagorno-Karabakh, and when we also talk about undemocratic peace, we need to talk about what Azerbaijan is. It is an oil dictatorship. So if you're forcing a democracy to negotiate with a dictator who imprisons every alternative political voice or media in his own country, that by default is an undemocratic scenario where this type of political leadership is dictating the terms and then exploiting the narrative that comes out of the capitals, whether it's Moscow, Brussels, Paris, or Washington, D.C. And I'll give you another most recent example. During the trilateral meeting of President of Azerbaijan, Ilham Aliyev, EU Council President Charles Michel, and Armenia's Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan, the statement that was released was very vague and referred to Nagorno-Karabakh as Karabakh, referred to Armenians as ethnic Armenians of the region, which was another trap that Europeans fell in, clearly Azerbaijani narrative of referring to these terms. Now, was it deliberate or not? That's not important, really. What is important is that on May 27th, Ilham Aliyev, being in Zangilan district, made statements that international community agrees with Azerbaijan that we don't have, there's no such administrative unit as Nagorno-Karabakh, that it's Karabakh, and agrees that we need to have the so-called Zangez corridor. And luckily, we saw a few days after that, EU Council President's spokesperson releasing a statement basically directed at Azerbaijan, saying that, don't, and I'm not quoting verbatim, essentially saying that there are no extraterritorial agreements discussed, and those please do not misinterpret the terminology, et cetera, et cetera. So it's become, I'm sure that that's very clear in these capitals that they're dealing with a dictator. But now when they start realizing that dictators play with the same playbook, they're ingenuine, they're not trustworthy, and they can exploit their narrative to their own benefits and for their own domestic agenda, then we see the statement coming out of the EU. And really, it serves to Armenia's interest. We need to keep this narrative that this is a dictatorship we're dealing with. And any type of this forced peace agenda, when we have POWs remaining in illegal detention in Azerbaijan, when we have multiple evidence of war crimes during the war, when we have a UN member state breaking the COVID period non-combat commitment, breaking the principle of not use of force in the framework of ONC Minsk Group, used violence and force and initiated a war, still walks freely without any international entity acknowledging that this is a war criminal and this regime is dangerous not only for its own people but for regional security. We need to constantly articulate this narrative that dealing with this type of regime is undemocratic and playing by their book and accepting that their terms, where they're canceling out the existence and the rights of the people of Artsakh, is undemocratic.
Thank you. Wonderfully said, Irina. You mentioned how these myths and false beliefs contributed to the catastrophic conclusion of the 2020 war. What about some of the false beliefs that have emerged since the war, about the war and developments since the war? Does anything come to mind? Yeah.
Unfortunately, a lot of things come to mind, and
the loss of Hadrut, I guess, the loss of Shushi, the defense, who's responsible for defense in these areas, what actually happened, but yeah, whatever comes to mind.
I think one of the biggest failures of this administration has been not committing to the statements made early after the war from the highest levels of political office of this administration, that a true and full investigation will be done on what had transpired during the war and who is responsible for lack of ammunition, lack of fuel, top military generals deserting their men, so many issues that needed to be properly investigated, properly understood. And we saw not only marginal, but very negligent part of that addressed by the government. There were attempts by various organizations and entities to set up truth commission and to do full investigation and accountability to how this government really failed and where, so that we can start building on, not simply patching those gaps, but before until you diagnose what is the problem, then you can't start the security reform. You can't start effective military reform. What was different, let's say, in the esprit de corps of our soldiers this time during the war as compared to the 1990s? Why was there no esprit de corps, which is the case, obviously, because we saw so many men deserting them. The combat and battlefield. So much to be investigated, which was not, and this perpetuation of this lack of being frank and transparent, that this exercise needs to be done, and the government should be doing that, and not only nitpicking and cherry picking some criminal cases launched against certain military officials, but doing a full investigation. Obviously, this has to be classified, et cetera, but to my knowledge, nothing close to this exercise is being done. And this government is not taking the responsibility. And the first act of taking responsibility is to conduct full and transparent investigation, which then obviously whatever can be declassified and brought to the judgment of the public should be done. But nothing of that sort is happening. Another perpetuating myth, I think, is a very unfortunate myth that this administration continues to articulate, and that is we're opening the era of peace, right? So Armenia's political administration talks about what does that mean? It's a cognitive dissonance, because we never broke peace in the first place for us to open the era of peace. Again, let's be reminded that it was Azerbaijan that started the war. This was, by the way, confirmed by all of the co-chairing countries of the Minsk group, by their respective intelligence entities, that yes, indeed, Azerbaijan started the war. So it was Azerbaijan who started the war, broke one of the principles of the OSCE Minsk group negotiations, and attempted to resolve the conflict through force. So when we talk about let's open the era of peace, what does that mean? And in the speech by Nikol Pashinyan in the parliament, I think it was April 13th, when he talked about lowering the bar, again, we saw that you can't keep conceding on positions, particularly diplomatic and political positions, when you have an adversary that has maximalist views, has not reduced them, has in fact increased them with continuous talks of Western Zangezur and Goicha and Yerevan being Azerbaijani historic lands. We need to be focused on not pleasing the international community with Yerevan's readiness to engage in negotiations, but rather we need to be focused on, first of all, the domestic work we need to do in giving a true assessment of what had transpired, why it transpired like that, and how we need to improve. And secondly, talking to international partners about holding this dictator and his regime accountable. Because if we continue to talk about opening the era of peace, a huge myth that is failing and costing Armenia domestic instability, we will be trapped further into not only domestic instability, but continuous failure in the current negotiation format, which I strongly believe is leading nowhere.
Would you be able to shed some light as to what you think Pashinyan's strategy might be, Prime Minister Pashinyan's strategy might be to engaging in these bits, or framing the question in this manner, which is absolutely misleading? Is there a strategy that that's not being touched upon? By that I mean, I don't mean anything. I mean, just is there anything more sound and competent than appears not to be?
I think if we scratch a little bit on the surface of this, Armenia is ready for peace dialogues, let's engage in the era of peace. The strategy right now with the Prime Minister's office and to some degree with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is that of realization, or rather assessment, that given that current security architecture of Artsakh is within the hands of Russia, and more specifically, the peacekeeping forces that have been deployed on November 10th following the trilateral statement, and that Armenia, by default, not having the previous security guarantees over Artsakh as it had, does not have the political and diplomatic leverage over Nagorno-Karabakh. And that has led to this administration putting these two issues into different categories. First, the status of Nagorno-Karabakh and the issues relating to security of the people and the rights of Artsakh are not within, not so much the scope of official Yerevan, but rather not in the scope of the power, political and diplomatic power of official Yerevan. This is my reading of the current administration of Nikol Pashinyan, given that when we saw violations of the trilateral statement by Azerbaijani forces multiple times now, a year and a half into the peacekeeping forces being stationed in Artsakh, the response from Yerevan was this occurred in the territory under the control and supervision of the Russian peacekeeping forces. So Yerevan itself officially articulated that, look, the peacekeepers are stationed there. It's their job to secure the situation on the ground. So a number of these statements obviously creates perhaps an assumption that this is the strategy whereby Armenian current administration wants to put the diplomatic and political responsibility along with security architecture of Artsakh on Russia, and then try to continue negotiating on delimitation and demarcation of the borders with Azerbaijan, inclusive of the recognition of Azerbaijani territorial integrity as a separate process. Now, this in and of itself is not necessarily a very problematic scenario, because recognition of Azerbaijan's territorial integrity does not by default cancel out the issue of the status of Nagorno-Karabakh, although that's what Baku officially articulates. In international legal term, that's not the case. So
you explain that a little bit, because one would think that it does actually. Because
yes.
One would think that when you recognize Azerbaijan's territorial integrity, that in also you're recognizing Azeri sovereignty over Nagorno-Karabakh.
Yeah, well,
that's not the case. Are you saying
no,
that's not the case?
No, from international legal perspective, that's not the case, because when we talk about territorial integrity and in the scope of in the legal scope of territorial integrity, when we look from when we give definition from international legal perspective, territorial integrity is acquired through force. And in general, all of your precedents and the way international law refers to that, right? Because we have cases of the post-colonial periods and the formation of the states, et cetera, et cetera. So from that perspective, you know, by default, territorial integrity the concept of territorial integrity does not exclude or does not contradict with the concept of self-determination of peoples. Unlike this, we have heard for many decades that they don't align with each other, but these are more of a political assessments. In the international legal terms, these do not necessarily not cohabit with each other. So from that perspective, yes, recognition of territorial integrity of Azerbaijan does not necessarily lead to canceling out of the discussions and negotiations over the format of Nagorno-Karabakh status. Now, this also very intimately—
If I may say, it would still be status within an Azerbaijani state structure, though, correct? This concept of self-determination might also— many will think that that's a mechanism for independence, but it can also be a mechanism for governance within an existing state territorial entity, let's say an Azerbaijani state entity, though, correct?
No, not necessarily. And I want to explain this to you from the perspective of international law and also the current proceedings that we have in the International Court of Justice. If you are aware, Armenia filed claims against Azerbaijan in September of 2021 at the International Court of Justice, which is otherwise called the World Court, which is a UN body, based on the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Now, this is a very important convention, although, you know, from the first sight, you think, well, what does the status of Artsakh and the security and the rights of people of Artsakh have to do with this particular convention? But when you look, open up that convention, to which both Armenia and Azerbaijan are signatories to, you realize that what had transpired with Armenians over the past not only 30 years in terms of Azerbaijan articulating state-sponsored Armenian discrimination, racial discrimination, and Armenophobia, but what had happened in the 70 years of Nagorno-Karabakh being administratively subjugated to the rule of Baku was a clear sign of racial and ethnic-based discrimination against Armenians. And when you document all of this, you realize that a significant chunk of this convention was actually violated by Azerbaijan. And Armenia's legal counsel advised the country that you need to proceed because you have enough evidence and you have enough basis to claim that indeed Azerbaijan has for decades engaged in state-sponsored, not only racial discrimination, but glorification of violence against Armenians. And this came from state structures, the highest top officials of the Azerbaijani government. Now, the claims were filed in September of 2021. The court order on the provisional measures, including the jurisdiction of the case, was I think November, December, and the court has officially received the case, received the claims, and will start the proceedings. What is important to understand is also that these types of proceedings last years because there's exorbitant amounts of evidence that the court has to go through, analyze, assess, and give assessments to. And this can last anywhere between 5 to even 10 years. But the conclusion, let's say hypothetically, we have the court conclude in its final judgment that indeed Azerbaijan has engaged, and I'm confident with the evidence that we have, the likelihood of the judgment of the court being very pro-Armenian is quite high, that the Azerbaijani government has engaged in state-sponsored racial discrimination, Armenophobia, and glorification of crimes against Armenians. And hence, once the judgment of the court is there, you argue not only legally, but also politically that the Armenians of Artsakh cannot be subjugated thus to the rule of Baku. And here we come to this so blurry concept of not remedial secession, because there's nothing to cede from, but rather remedial or phased sovereignty, where the Armenians of Artsakh acquire sovereignty as part also of the process that is happening in the international court, and that is acknowledgement that a government has engaged in state-sponsored discrimination. And you know, the memorials will be submitted by the Armenian government, respective office of the Armenian government, I think in January of 2023, and the proceedings will show that there's extremely high volume of evidence going all the way back to Sumgait and Baku pogroms, to the case, the infamous case of Safarov, and his, not only his pardoning, but his glorification of his morbid crime, his proclamation as a hero in Azerbaijan, et cetera, et cetera. So there are multiple instances where the case is clearly made by the Armenian side, and I'm very confident that the outcome will be positive. What we need to now do is ensure that the legal doctrine of Armenia is aligned with the political, and hence any discussion on the status of Nagorno-Karabakh has to be postponed until the judgment is made on this case. Because if the court judges that these people cannot be subjugated to the rule of Baku, then we have the political weight, not only legal, but also political weight to say remedial secession and remedial sovereignty is in place. We demand the independence and recognition of Nagorno-Karabakh. So that's very key. And that's why it's extremely important to have a systemic and aligned approach within the government of Armenia to work in a synergy.
Thank you, Irina. You're doing great as we approach 3:30 in the morning in Yerevan. Are we okay with a couple more questions? A couple from the audience, and then maybe and then we'll start to wrap it up? Okay. Suren asks, I think today the biggest myth is that there is no third-party opposition that would not be corrupt and not compromised and unprofessional. How could we break this myth? This nation got talent.
Yes, absolutely. I fully agree with Suren that this nation has talent. We have some incredible minds, both at home and abroad, those who are committed, those who are transparent and want to see a stronger and more resilient Armenia. Breaking off that myth would be a tough endeavor, considering that the current political discourse is generated, unfortunately, also by this administration. Let's be reminded that this administration did articulate the narrative of the black and the white, right? And this opposition feeds into that narrative, and this government reinforces that. Now is the right time for a credible political force to emerge, to showcase that, on the one hand, the current opposition represents largely the return to the past, where you had oligarchy and corruption rampant within the government institutions, and you had institutions weakening at the expense of the wealth of the politicians and their very close nexus of supporters. And on the other hand, you have perhaps a good-willed administration, but sorely lacking capacity for effective governance. For various objective and subjective reasons. This is the right time and the right timing as well, because our next elections are in a few years, to project a new team, to work around that team, and to give them voice and platforms to speak about their agenda, and then be ready for the next elections.
Pamela asks, given your crucially important perceptions, what is your deepest understanding as to why the Armenian leadership has allowed themselves to become enslaved to the myths and self-defeating behaviors? I mean, enslaved is a key word here. I think they're also part of the problem, right?
Yes.
So, yeah.
I think it's not only Armenia's problem. I think it's problem of power by default, and not to be too obsolete in stating some classical terms that that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But I remember when I was in the government and we were discussing some painful and needed reforms within the management of natural resources of Armenia. Eric, my colleague and minister at the time, Eric Cohen, said, if we push for these reforms, this administration will not be reelected. And bottom line, most of your political administrations get trapped in a lot of myths and a lot of populist narratives, because particularly for Armenia, significant reforms that will improve governance, that will set up the right social order, will not necessarily be very popular. So that's one side of things. The other thing is that, unfortunately, this particular government has a problem with populism being a significant portion of their communication with their citizenry and their electorate. And we see, even if we track in the last 4 years, right, the commitments given and the list of promises given by this administration at the beginning of their ascent to power and what we have now, there's a big gap. So we haven't seen that. So this definitely is the issue that unfortunately they get enslaved into these myths, because there's a lot of populism, but the capacity to undertake these types of reforms requires very robust strategy, very robust action plan, and strong human talent within your team to undertake that. So that's another unfortunate reason why these administrations get enslaved, as you rightly noted, into these myths or by these myths.
And what might be some steps to take to mitigate this obstructionist role and insidious effect of false beliefs and myths? And what do you think? Because obviously the cost is great for not taking steps, right? Armenian sovereignty is at risk. Its future is at risk.
Absolutely. I think the costs of not preventing are far worse than taking the action now. The problem is that you do see some fragmented, attempts by this government and by different ministries to do that. But there has to be a systemic approach. There has to be not simply a visionary leadership. It has to be a systemic and skilled leadership that understands that governance is not linear. It's extremely connected, intersectional, and systemic. And again, unfortunately, although good-willed, this administration lacks this type of talent. And getting over it would require some good advisory team willing to listen to advices, which this prime minister is notorious to not to, based on my understanding and experience. So there's a lot that needs to be done, and certainly not to criticize too much the current administration as compared to others. And I think we need to constantly be reminded how others have failed. Unfortunately, this administration inherited a very problematic, not only domestic governance infrastructure, but also foreign policy agenda. But again, there is a lack of not only visionary approach towards governance issues, but also a strategic, robust action plan, and of course, human talent.
So those would be maybe the suggestions you would give the prime minister, because that was a question that was asked from Alexander. Asked, what are 3 suggestions you would give the prime minister? What recommendations? Would that be it, you would think?
I don't know, it's a tough question. It's a tough question because 3 is very little number, but then those 3 would have to be such key recommendations that I wouldn't know where to start, But if I would divide the current existing domestic and foreign policy related problems, I think that the 3 advices that I would give to not only this administration, but generally leadership is more authenticity and transparency in leadership. Something, again, I'll reiterate that this administration came on that promise, and that's, I think, there has been their biggest capital, unfortunately, until the war of 2020. This transparency needs to be restored, and it's, I believe, in aspiring democracies, the biggest political capital any political leader can have. I think focusing on systemic reform of the government and allowing true technocrats and experts to undertake these reforms would be absolutely instrumental for Armenia, whether we're talking about Ministry of Health, where we see some movements and some injection of diaspora talent into the system, or Ministry of Education, or of course, Ministry of Defense, some of the most resistant institutions. The public administration reform, both to improve the internal governance as well as reforms towards a more strategic approach on policy development in all of these institutions, which currently also the government lacks. If you look at every ministry, the policy development departments, unfortunately, are the most underinvested. And The third advice would be a lot more engagement with foreign entities, whether on a bilateral or multilateral level. There has to be a whole host of modalities for engagement. There has to be civil society track 1.2, track 2 diplomacy. Government has to support all of these processes, but also has to have a very sound strategy of legal diplomacy, political diplomacy, and of course, strategic communication. This is obviously that comes out from foreign policy as your main instrumentary, which this government lacks. It doesn't communicate strategically well at all. It is attempting and trying to, but I think it continuously fails. So that again, your strategic communication has to be built on very sound policies and strategies that have to be developed for each neighboring country, each key partner, whether it's in Central Asia or the European Union, and of course with multilaterals. That again, I'll reiterate, there's a lot of work to be done. Whether we're talking about UNESCO, a very key UN institution, that we could have invested a lot more diplomacy into that, and hence work towards the preservation of our cultural heritage in Artsakh and Armenia, or the UN Security Council. Again, there has to be more strategic and engaged involvement and diplomacy with these institutions.
Thank you. Two more questions, and this is the penultimate question, actually already answered right now in part, but given your background, I think I'd like to ask the second part of Ninel's question. Can you talk about ecological strategies, potential dangers of water and other natural sources, and the management thereof? I mean, given your background, perhaps, yeah.
Absolutely.
And even though this is not necessarily a myth, and even though this is not in the myth area, but we've got you, so we're going to ask you.
No, sure. I'm happy that this question came up. With the environmental security, unfortunately, again, Armenia is in a very vulnerable situation. The country has been ranked as fourth most vulnerable country to climate change in Eastern Europe and Central Asia region. That obviously stems from a number of geographical as well as political aspects, including that the country is landlocked, and including that the country is located in the downstream region. So South Caucasus in its entirety is a downstream region. And for example, Azerbaijan's waters, 76% of Azerbaijan's surface waters originates from outside of the territory of Azerbaijan. In fact, I did have a discussion in Stockholm last year arguing that part of what played into the timing of Azerbaijan initiating the war in Nagorno-Karabakh was shortages of water in that country, which are actually a lot severer than what we are seeing and are going to see in Armenia and in Georgia. But one thing is clear is that the upstream country in our region is Turkey. And there have already been a number of statements, not only from Iraq, but also from Iranian leadership, as high as the Iranian president, stating that what they called as Turkey's preying politics on water resources of the region result in not only severe droughts and lack of water resources downstream, but obviously cause social and economic crises, because these regions and these countries depend heavily on agriculture. So absolutely, water is going to become an increasingly critical resource for all sectors of Armenia's economy, not only agriculture. And unless we start investing heavily now, not only in water infrastructure, that is renovating 80 plus water reservoirs we have or building new ones, and also, water diplomacy. We have to continue talking about that, because obviously with Armenia having 30% of its energy needs coming from renewables, most of which currently at this time come from hydropower resources, we need to be very clear understanding that in the next few years, as water resources start to decline and river flows start to decline, the energy infrastructure in Armenia will also suffer. So absolutely, it's a whole different topic, and there's so much to discuss. And part of the reason why I also gradually migrated or stepped with one foot into the environmental security and climate negotiations is because I strongly believe that the era of fossil fuels is coming to an end, and Armenia is one country that we're incredibly well positioned, not having had the resource curse of having the fossil fuels. We should start investing very early on, not only in infrastructure for renewables, but also in infrastructure for energy efficiency, in biodiversity conservation, water management, and the entire spectrum of elements pertaining to environmental management. And this is an extremely political agenda, and Armenia can and should position itself as a counter to a neighboring oil dictatorship, right? A country that is a democracy that is investing in its green growth and green future, and is looking towards an era that's going to come after fossil fuels, which we're starting to see the beginning of the end of hydrocarbons. So that's an important topic in and of itself, and a lot to discuss. But absolutely, Armenia has serious challenges, but also very good opportunities to invest early and become the pioneer in the club of countries committing to green growth.
Thank you, Irina. Thank you. And lastly, tell us a little bit about other projects that you're working on, or what you're working on, and what your agenda is over the next 6 months, let's say, or 3 months.
My agenda,
because I think that's an important for your, your book is dedicated to your 3 children, right? And you hope for, and your hope for a better Armenia for them. So tell us how you're contributing to that at this point.
Well, I think physically being in Armenia for me is absolutely existential, because I always feel like part of my physical and mental and emotional being is always in Armenia. And when I'm away for too long, I start getting anxiety. So one aspect is clear. I'm born and raised in Armenia, but I've spent quite a significant period of my professional life abroad, studying, learning, educating myself, and also working in various institutions. So being home is existential for me. Another aspect is, again, already discussed. I'm heavily involved in working as part of the developmental agenda for Armenia on green growth, as well as I absolutely love teaching at the American University of Armenia. I have pitched new courses on including to be included in the green and sustainable environment related courses at the American University of Armenia. And I absolutely love that job, because being in the classroom with students always inspires me. I feel that I owe them, my generation owes them, a more secure and stable and resilient Armenia. And teaching is something that I absolutely love doing, and I hope to continue. Some of my other professional work, as you mentioned at the beginning, I work as senior climate change advisor to the World Bank. And I'm also a co-founder of International Law and Policy Center. It's a foundation which I co-founded with my colleagues that works in 3 different directions. One is international litigation. So we advise government and other stakeholders on what potential international litigation can be sound and expedient for Armenia. Also, the second direction is legal diplomacy, how to engage most effectively on various platforms for Armenia's causes. And third is strategic communication. As I mentioned earlier, this is something that Armenia lacks significantly. This stems from the lack of legal doctrine and political, if you will, and foreign policy doctrine sound at that for articulation of good and effective strategic communication. So these are 3 directions that our foundation works. We established ourselves last year, and we're working at expanding the scope of our work.
Wonderful. Congratulations and good luck.
Thank you so much.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. Irina, this has been special for me. It's been special, I think, for much of our audience from all the questions and the comments that we're receiving. And once again, my apologies to all the audience members who asked questions that we could not present. But perhaps we'll create another opportunity at some point. Perhaps when you're not in this Yerevan time zone, just to make life a little bit
Yes,
easier.
when it's not 4 in the morning here, and now I'm more sound.
I know. No, you've been very sound, and I'm sorry that you've also committed part of your Thursday to this event as well.
No problem.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you to our audience members. Take good care. Be safe. Be well. Thank you.
Thank you.